My guest today is Lincoln Bleveans, an executive in the global energy industry for 30 years. A lot of even academics are on the side of the table that climate is its own issue and then maybe poverty is its own economic issue. Or do you see the synergy there?
To me, it's all one wickedly complex problem. It has endless feedback loops within itself. The problem looks different depending on which angle you view it from. You're never quite sure if you've solved it. Every decision that we make is a compromise. We can't poison our habitat in order to keep the global temperatures down.
I don't think many people could have predicted any of this half a century ago or 30 years ago or anything like that, because things move at a much faster speed and scale than we also anticipate.
In the last 30 years, we've seen more change than perhaps the 100 years that preceded that. But I look at the next decade and I see more change than we've seen since the industry was born. I like to say that if Thomas Edison came back to life today, he would probably have to squint, but he would recognize most of this electric system that he pioneered. I think 10 years from now, he could squint all he wants. He's not going to recognize what he sees. Are we adapting fast enough?
Welcome to Compassiviste Dialogues. I'm your host, Ali Horiat. My goal in this program is to educate our audience about various global issues and how we can help. My guest today is Lincoln Bleveans, an executive in the global energy industry for 30 years. And for those who aren't that aware, that's probably almost from the beginning of this industry. Today, he leads Stanford University's Mission Essential Operations and is world-leading innovation in climate action, including various sectors of it: sustainability, adaptation, resilience, circularity, justice, and in sectors such as electrical, thermal, water, waste utilities issues, and further infrastructure like dams and roads and all the bridges and the stormwater capture and our sewer systems and all of that. He also serves on advisory boards for climate technology startups in the US, Canada, Italy, and all the way to India, and hosts a global podcast called Climate Plus: Purpose and Prosperity in an Unprecedented World. Lincoln, welcome to Compassiviste Dialogues, and I am very excited to be speaking with you today.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
I want to start with, being that you are in this industry for over 3 decades, I want to know how you got interested in this space and what led you to be here. Because, when you look at the educational aspect and everything as well, being in the industry 30 years, it's probably half a century that you've been involved with this kind of stuff. So how did that start for you?
Well, I would like to say it was a straight line, but I actually kind of discovered it on accident. I was working in the capital markets in emerging markets in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and found that there were a lot of utilities, power companies, private equity firms that were developing and investing in private power plants and privately financed power plants in various countries around the world, mostly in emerging market countries at the time. And I honestly had probably never seen a power plant in my life, or at least seen one and known what it was. But I saw this as an opportunity to bring together engineering and law and regulation and operations and policy and frankly make a positive difference in the world, bringing reliable, clean power to places that didn't have enough of it. And so I started off in China, developing power plants, and on behalf of a utility in the U.S. And from there, Southeast Asia, South Asia, to North Africa, the Middle East, Central America, South America. And since then, I've been really across the value chain and around the world in the power business, as well as picking up a lot of experience on the water side as well, and increasingly the sustainability side, which leads me to my job here at Stanford, which covers both the sustainability aspect, climate action planning, but also 24/7 operations, as you mentioned, for all of our vertically integrated utilities. So it's been quite a ride. I could not have predicted this when I started out.
I don't think many people could have predicted any of this, half a century ago or 30 years ago or anything like that, because uh, things move at a much faster speed and scale than we also anticipate. I mean, we get reports out from industry leaders like yourself about what's happening or what's going to happen and how the space is functioning, and then we get these reports that are 20, 30 years away, and then it happens 5 years later or happens 7 years later, and it kind of like resets everything in your industry, so to speak. Are you feeling that things are happening at a much faster rate or accelerating at a faster rate, so to speak, from anticipated?
Certainly the rate of acceleration. When I got it, just by chance, I got into the business at exactly the right time when the electric utility space was transitioning from perhaps the most conservative, stodgiest, low growth industry in the world to one of the most dynamic and one of the fastest growing in the world. And seeing that through competitive markets, through deregulation, and increasing incredible amounts of private capital coming into the space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really transformative over the last 30 years or so. But what I'm seeing now is, as you mentioned, an uptick in the rate of acceleration. I think about the industry from the perspective that in the last 30 years, we've seen more change than perhaps in the 100 years that preceded that. But I look at the next decade and I see more change than we've seen in the last, since the industry was born, just in the next decade. I think I like to say that if Thomas Edison came back to life today, he would probably have to squint, but he would recognize most of this electric system that he pioneered. I think 10 years from now, he could squint all he wants. He's not going to recognize what he sees. It's going to be that transformative.
Okay. So the revolution is upon us, so to speak. That's what's happening. So. Well, for this revolution, I'm excited because it's good news revolution. It's not a bad revolution. And, speaking of that, we face so many challenges today. So we've got climate change, which is huge. I mean, it's not a separate challenge. I try to explain this to people in the sense that when you speak of certain issues, you could kind of localize the issue and tackle it. But I always tell people there's always a climate change or global warming angle to any problem, no matter how small or how you want to look at it. You could be walking and you're walking on freezing rain, you fall, you break your leg. Somehow I could tie that, and it's in, say, October. This shouldn't be happening. I could tie that to global warming for you. Poverty, homelessness, diseases, so many things can be tied to the climate issue, but not a lot of people are actually making those connections. So I want to ask you about pollution, endemic diseases, and the need for renewed urgency to social, economic, and environmental justice from a framework of implementing these solutions with climate resilience, so to speak, in mind, and bringing that to the table. Do you agree with that, or are you on the side of the table where a lot of even academics are on the side of the table that climate is its own issue, and then maybe poverty is its own economic issue? Or do you see the synergy there?
To me, it's all one wickedly complex problem, and a wicked problem in the scientific sense of the word, in that it has endless feedback loops within itself. It is, the problem looks different depending on which angle you view it from. You're never quite sure if you've solved it, But I see all these issues: climate change, endemic, uh, pollution, air, soil, and water, and of course the justice issues around economics, environment, climate, as well as rising generations who for whom this is just the world, and they're not taking no for an answer. They're not even taking slow for an answer. And so I see this as altogether what we do on the climate side has to also check the box. And we have to solve the greenhouse gas problem, but we also have to do that in a way that solves the justice problem and frankly solves the economic challenges. And I'll give you an example of electricity. We're doing something unprecedented right now as a plant, as a species. We are trying to both decarbonize our electric supply, but also electrify our entire world. So we are fundamentally, unprecedentedly changing the electric system at the same time that we are driving ourselves toward a massive increase in reliance on that very system. This is, I mean, either one of those would be a huge challenge. Together, they're mind-boggling. But we're going to do it. We're going to figure it out. As we do that, though, when we look at things like the cost impact of doing that, how do we do that in a way that does not unjustly impact lower income communities? And just as an example, if we electrify transportation, great for us. But if electric rates are so high from decarbonization that people can't afford to get to work, then we haven't really solved the whole equation. If we put in so many solar panels and so many batteries and so many wind turbines without sorting out the front end issues around rare earth metals, which, cobalt from the Congo, lithium from Chile, all sorts of different things from China, really a horrific raw material scenario at the front end, as well as in my opinion, unsolved recycling, reuse, repurposing, disposal equation on the back end. We've got to solve for climate, but we can't sacrifice our most vulnerable, and we've got to solve for climate, but we can't sacrifice our environment in order to solve the climate issue. We can't poison our habitat in order to keep the global temperatures down. So it really is a wickedly complex problem, a wickedly complex equation that we need to solve. And so I'm very much in the camp. In fact, I'm probably one of the louder cheerleaders for this idea that it looks like separate problems from a distance, but if you really look at it, you'll see that you don't have to peel the onion very far to realize it's all just one big wicked challenge.
I've two questions for you regarding what you said. The first is I really appreciate that you are honest about the challenges, because a lot of people sweep under the rug the Congo and Chile and places like that. And it happens in all places. It's not just in the energy section. I mean, it's happening in different industries as well. We turn a blind eye to the comforts and the privileges that we receive at the prices that we want to receive them at. So, we just pretend we don't, it shouldn't matter where the battery is coming from, where the motor is coming from, where the electric grid is coming from. It just matters that we have access to it and it's cleaner, so to speak. And I feel better about buying my Tesla because I'm doing better for the environment and so on. So, and you kind of said, no, that's not the reality. So that's great. Is there then an alternative? Because when you speak that way, you're also saying that, okay, we're transitioning from fossil fuels, from, your traditional gas station, but we're not transitioning to a harmonious system, or a sustainable system, because at the end of the day, the cobalt and the lithium and the copper and everything else also will run out, because the earth does not grow them like trees or mushrooms, right? Now, if you believe, being that you're in deep, you're knee deep in the industry, if you believe that this transition is a temporal transition or a momentary transition to the next level, which, for example, is a technology that is absolutely sustainable, absolutely renewable, and we don't have to worry about the slave labor issues on the social side, and we don't have to worry about the actual, abundance of the source of energy. That's a happy thing because we're going through this stage to reach the end point that will solve all our problems, so to speak. But if science doesn't have a solution that gets us to that space, where do you think this is going to go when we start fighting for cobalt, when that runs out? I mean, what are we going to run on?
Yeah, no, I I worry about that. I worry about that
Okay.
a lot. That our resource conflicts will shift from the the areas with hydrocarbons to the areas with rare earth metals, and of course, everybody suffers when that happens. I worry about that a lot. But ultimately, all energy is compromise, and when you look at you look at the environmental impact, for example, of a natural gas plant or a coal plant. It's very, very light on the front end and the back end. It's very, very heavy in operation because of the fuel that's
Mm.
being combusted. When you look, as I mentioned before, when you look at renewable technologies, excuse me, you're looking at a very, very clean operational period, but huge impacts on the front end and the back end. So you're really
Mhm.
swapping one for the other. When you look at a hydroelectric plant, for example, a big hydroelectric plant, on the one hand, you've got very, very, carbon-free energy that's produced for the 50, 100 years that that dam is in operation. But you've also irretrievably lost landscape and habitat. You've created an immense amount of carbon in the concrete that goes into that dam. So my goal is less, and also because I'm not a scientist or an engineer, my goal is less about solving the problem than trying to help people see it with eyes wide open, eyes wide open. If you haven't found the compromise yet in whether it's climate or environment or social or or economic, you really haven't looked far enough, because
Mhm.
every every form of, and this goes back to the first, the laws of thermodynamics. Every form of energy is a compromise, and frankly, every decision that we make is a compromise. Sometimes we don't realize that, but my goal right now is to help people understand where those compromises are, and not in terms of putting up roadblocks, but in terms of making the conversation more sophisticated. And we're going to compromise. Let's do that with eyes wide open.
And if we take that route, um, you take me back to the days when I was studying economics at university, and there was always this equation that you had to hold so many things constant for this equation to be true. And in the beginning, I used to always say, but why? The real world doesn't work this way. Why am I learning this? Why am I learning how to balance this equation that is never real? It's like a Disney fairy tale of an equation. What's the goal here? And so now, when you speak of compromise with eyes wide open, I think to myself, well, in a sense, then we don't have a solution other than escapism as a solution, because the earth is limited, and eventually we will run through the resources. There is no, or as of yet, there is no science that is giving us a sustainable solution, meaning that there will be enough apples on the tree every season for the three people who live on in the reserve around the tree to sustain life for as long as the natural life cycle goes. At some point in our 50s, one has to die, and so we're going to analyze that, and we're going to think, who shall we kill out of the three of us at 50, and then let the other two live to 90? That's the reality of what you're saying, in a very, I guess, extreme manner, so that it hits the mark for people, right? I mean, when you talk about compromise, that is what the world is doing. I mean, some parts of the world are up in flames, wars, conflicts. And these are the compromises that we make. I mean, kids in cobalt mines in Africa, that's the compromise that we make. So even in shifting to better solutions, we're always simply transitioning from one conflict model to another that maybe ameliorates the situation or facilitates a more humanistic transition, but we're never really solving it. That's the thing. So then, if that's the issue, is Elon Musk onto something then by saying, never mind the whole let's solve the carbon issue of this planet, but let's figure out ways that we can, you know, reach other spaces so that we don't have to compromise, but we can use and just discard, kind of fast fashion with planets.
Well, it's certainly possible. I see it. I see it from a technology perspective
Mhm.
and an innovation perspective. But for me, the innovation also has to happen on the other side of the coin, and that's human beings. Um, we we can't. I don't believe that we can technology our way out of this. Um,
Right.
I
Okay.
don't think that's the whole solution. I think that the what we do as humans, the way we behave, circular economy is a perfect example of this. You know, we've been running our world on as a linear economy for at least 100 years now, and we
Mhm.
are now paying the price. And it's not about doing something new; it's about rediscovering what we used to do when we, instead of throwing things away, we mended them. Instead of throwing things away, throwing rags away, we collected them and sent them to the paper
Mhm.
industry. Um, there's a lot that we can rediscover in terms of behaviors, and it's a little bit like energy efficiency in that when it comes to waste, what the cleanest, cheapest kilowatt hour or next kilogram of waste is the one that you don't produce in the first place. So how do we find that reduce, reuse, recycle, repurpose? How do we find much more efficient ways to dispose of things that can't fit into any of those categories, as opposed to just dumping them in a landfill? How do we change our own behavior, or not? Maybe change is too scary for a lot of people. How do we adjust our own behavior so that we can become a little bit more congruent with what has to happen? And frankly, I see that as saving money at the same time, because if we can learn to buy a little bit less, if we can learn to use a little bit less, and if we can learn, frankly, and thinking of food in particular, waste a little bit less, that's not only great for the climate, great for the environment, but hey, we're saving money at the same time. And how do we find those behavior solutions make both climate sense, environmental sense, but also economic sense, so that ultimately they become hopefully a no-brainer. But we have to learn how to do those things.
And when you say learn, again, you brought up circular economies. And when you say we've been living in a linear economy for the last 100 years, we've been living in uh, kind of an extremist capitalist society for the last 100 years. Is essentially what that linear economy looks like when you put it on a graph. And you cannot take away greed all of a sudden to implement all those lovely ideas, because that is the basis of how we run our world today. It's based on that. And therefore, the overconsumption that you talk about, reduce a little here, waste a little less there, and all of those is, reversing the overconsumption that we're going through. But doing that affects all our economic systems. So reducing overconsumption will probably defund your industry very quickly from investing into all the solutions and the technologies and everything else, because all the people who are making a ton of money uh, that are now making less money in the world as GDP scales back are not. Imagine you're in 2008, 2009, and you're going out there trying to raise money for anything. It's not going to happen because everybody's in crunch mode. So how do we get into circular economies with an ideology that is opposed to circular economies? Because this goes back to a famous Einstein quote, we can't solve the problems with the same mindset that we created them. And so we can't solve our overconsumption by saying, you know what, circular economies was cool. They worked, they were fine, and they were non-over consuming. And, it's a good idea. Let's go there. Let's take our banks. Let's take our interest rates and everything else and our inflation and all that, throw it into the circular economy and see how it'll work. And then it'll crash. So when you talk about humans need to change, it's beautiful because you're talking about we need to change our economic systems. Aside from thinking that there's going to be a pill or a technology or Lincoln Blevins is going to win some Nobel Prize for an innovation that's going to suck all the carbon out of the world, and we're home free, and we're going to put a big statue of Lincoln, on Washington Drive, and everybody's going to, remember Lincoln 200 years later for saving the world. That is not a reality that's going to happen. You're laughing at it because you're thinking that's not we're not going to technology ourselves out of the situation, like you said. So speaking on the spiritual side of things, do you think it's a policy thing that is going to shift the mindset where governments become more centralized as opposed to decentralized to be able to make that shift happen? Do you think it's a market thing that we'll just have to wait to crash to a point where the wildfires have taken over, the world's just going upside down, that dystopian future that you see in the movies, and people come together and say, okay, we actually need to change? Or do you think it starts from the consumer side, as you were saying, let's reduce, let's, stop our overconsumptions, let's be more mindful, let's uh, be wary and conscious of food shortages, of social issues and everything else. Essentially, let's educate ourselves and act in respect to that. Which of those three do you think is going to be the leader over the next decade, along with this huge explosion of technology that you're talking about over the next decade that's going to align what you call the human behavior with the technology that's trying to help humans survive?
Well, I think overall, I see it as an all of the above strategy. I think it has to be economics and policy and consumer behavior, both regulatory carrots and regulatory sticks. But ultimately, it's all a human enterprise. Policymakers are ultimately part of the, as much as we don't think of them this way sometimes, all are ultimately part of the human enterprise, ultimately part of humanity. And so as a species, we control all of the things that you mentioned. I think as we see generational shifts, as we see the impacts of this world that we've created, and I'll use Superstorm Sandy on the east coast of the U.S. back in 2011 as an example. I was living in the New York area at the time, and it was profound. It was a simply once in 500 years sort of storm that and those aren't just happening every 500 years anymore. But it really rocked the fabric from a political perspective. It really rocked the fabric from an economic and social perspective. There will always be doubters. There will always be dissenting voices. But you see what New York State has done in response to that event. I mean, that Superstorm Sandy kicked off an absolute full court press on climate issues, on adaptation to a changing climate, on resilience to a changing climate, and first and foremost to mitigating changing climate through reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So these things change. Unfortunately, we humans tend to be a reactive species, or at least that's my experience. It takes a crisis for us to really
To wake up.
rethink things. And sometimes even a crisis doesn't get us to rethink things. I mean, look at gun policy in the U.S. But I see Mother Nature is pretty angry with us right now, and we're seeing that more and more and more. And to me, these storms, these events can be catalysts to
Mm.
rethinking at the policy level, at the economic level, in the financial markets, at the consumer level, from local to state to federal to global. These sorts of events can be catalysts to rethinking those things. And frankly, I think, you look at all that New York State has done over the last decade plus since Superstorm Sandy. And, to your point earlier about, economic trouble, I don't think it's been economically problematic at all. I think the economy has shifted, but the prosperity is the same or better. It's just that instead of doing X, we're doing Y. Instead of thinking about building many more natural gas-fired power plants, we're thinking about we're building renewable. Those same people are doing, and same capital are doing renewables and energy storage and energy efficiency projects. So I I think this is all going to happen together. I think it's all under our control as a species. And to me, it doesn't have to be, it has to be adaptive, but it doesn't have to be disruptive as we
Hmm.
go through this. Now, what that implies is that it's going to take a while. And frankly, it's going to take a while. And that begs the larger question, of course, of can we adapt our world fast enough to prosper in the face of this climate change that we set in motion a couple hundred years ago? That's an open question, but I do see this as a all hands on deck, all of the above change management process that frankly, I don't see I see it being adaptive, but not disruptive
Hmm. Hmm.
ultimately. But of course, begging the question, how long is this going to take? And
Right,
are we adapting fast enough?
right. And that brings me to the word adapting inherently holds with it a very, very large implication to, and a prerequisite essentially to be educated, because you cannot adapt without knowing, right? And I feel the maladaptive evolution in this, climate change era that we're in, in this century alone, has really kind of aggravated the situation because we did not present the education alongside the technology and alongside the growth that the industry has had. So I'll give you an example so it makes more sense. In the food industry, um, if you were living in say the early 1900s, you go into a grocery store and you ask for tomato paste. They'll give you a jar, you know, hand screwed, and they'll say, "Here it is." There's no nutrition label on it. It's just, here's tomato paste. Now each store may make their own tomato paste in a different way. You really don't know the full ingredients or whatever. You could have allergies, you could die, anything could happen. We eventually said it's very important to bring the education to the table because it's a safety concern. So, health, inspection, safety, all those things, labels started coming on and they became progressively better to a point now where, I don't think you can get much better about the nutrition in terms of labeling. Of course, you can get better in terms of educating the public about what each of those ingredients means. But labeling wise, I think we're in a good spot. In the carbon world and in the environmental world, I see the education is almost non-existent, and the education we need essentially. And then the information is it's kind of like pulling tooth out from people. Like you just don't get information from anywhere, and therefore there's a lot of misunderstanding, miscommunication, and unfortunately cheating because you can. When nobody knows the rules of poker and you're the only person who does, you can cheat all you want because nobody's questioning whether you are allowed to do that or not in the game, and you always end up winning. But when people start learning the rules, you can't do that, right? And then when there's a body that's overlooking things, it just takes it one step further. And so do you feel that the restriction from making policies such as labeling the products with carbon labels, or bringing that information to people, or really bringing the education to our schools, so that kids today grow up with understanding carbon and values and numbers in the same relative way that they understand calories? So if you talk to, in the US, I'll give you an American example. You speak to most 16-year-old kids in the US, and they'll say they're interested in sports. They'll know a little bit about how many calories their favorite athlete eats a day, and they understand what that means, because relative to themselves, like, LeBron James has 7,000 calories. That's crazy. I can only do 2,000, right? And they compare themselves, and they have this amazing understanding of calorie counts, proteins, and efficient eating and everything else. Take that same example and tell them your favorite athlete spends X amount of kilowatts daily. All of a sudden, it's mute. There's no conversation. Nobody knows what you're talking about. There's no relativity. There's nothing. How do we? And I think that education leads to adaptation, because people talk about adaptation and us being maladaptive right now and everything else. And I tell them, from a scientific perspective, when you talk about maladaptivity, it's really an issue of your evolutionary core could not change in that millennium as fast as the world changed. And so you kind of like became extinct. We're not in that state. We're leading the world. If anything, we're the ones who are making everything else extinct. But we're intentionally becoming maladaptive because of our ignorance.
Yeah.
Do you have a solution for that? Or do you even think that is true?
I do. I don't have a solution for it, but I do think it's true. Yeah. So don't build that statue. Uh, Lincoln's not going to solve the world's problems. The To me, I love your nutrition example, because I think about grams of protein, grams of carbohydrates. When I was younger, those were absolutely esoteric concepts. Nobody,
Mhm.
those were not in the public dialogue. And now people can tell you about, oh, there are that many, I need this many grams of protein a day, and this thing has that many grams, or I'm limiting my carbohydrates to X number of grams. That's become part of the dialogue. And I think it's become part of the dialogue because it people have realized that it's important to their lives. And my health, the way my body feels, the way that my body looks, these things, this knowledge and this awareness is driving that that education. So it becomes personally important to people. And I think you're absolutely right in that tons of carbon emitted, or carbon emitted per mile or per whatever, it's not, people don't understand how that is personally important to them. And this is I think the fundamental, speaks to the fundamental challenge of climate change, in that it is a global problem, and any one single action is really not going to, or inaction is not going to move the needle. And people just don't see the impact. If they jump in a giant diesel truck with no emissions controls and drive across town, versus jumping in an electric car that's fueled by renewable energy and driving across town, they really don't feel that impact on their lives. They don't feel, oh, I just emitted more carbon. Some of us feel guilty about that, but guilt is not a great motivator. So I wonder if carbon is, we're ever going to find a way to actually connect that to people's lives. I don't have a solution to that, although I think about it a lot. The workaround that I've come up with, at least for now, is the idea of putting carbon aside. I think it has to be reported, it has to be labeled, like your tomato paste example. I think that's a great first step. But when we think about transportation, it can't be about the primary motivator can't be carbon. I'll give you an example. When I was back at a utility down in the Los Angeles area before I came to Stanford, we would do an electric car event, and this is 10 years ago. We would do an electric car event, and along with a bunch of other municipal utilities, and basically getting people into electric cars and having them drive around a parking lot, literally. And by the time they got back, having driven around the parking lot in an electric car, they wanted an electric car, not because it was it had XYZ climate impacts, but because it was really fast and it was really fun. And there was, no lag and no torque curve. And these things were, even then they were rocket ships compared to, and quiet and smooth. So we've got to sell what people feel. We got to sell what appeals to people. I think saying this has, X carbon content, it's really hard. I think it's important that we educate on those things. We have to have a general sense of it. But when it comes to motivating behavior, I think we've got to find ways to motivate behavior on a much more benefit-based scenario. Just to give it another example, when you think about the difference between fossil fueled electricity and renewable fueled electricity, you can have, especially in the United States, you can have endless political arguments about whether or not renewable energy is a good idea and whether or not global warming is real, and all these political things that we face, all these arguments that we face. But I think, or at least I hope, everyone can get around the same table on air quality. Everybody wants to breathe cleaner air. Everybody wants their kids and their grandkids and their loved ones to breathe cleaner air. So why aren't we selling renewable energy on a pollution first, as opposed to carbon first? Because pollution is, first of all, carbon is diffuse and it's global. Pollution is incredibly local. How and something that people can see and feel. How do we make that the selling point, that we're all going to breathe better? And even that becomes political in the U.S. I won't get up on that soapbox, but in general, that's a benefit that people can get their arms around, and that people can see. Oh yeah, so we're going to do renewable energy because I've got asthma, my kid's got asthma, and so on. Or I'm tired of smelling X, Y, and Z in the air. Really find it on a benefit basis. It might seem like, oh, we're dodging around the real issue. Oh, we're hiding the ball.
Right.
And I don't think that's true. I think we need to educate on that, but we need to meet humans where they are. And meeting humans where they are means going to the benefits, going to the excitement, and not the guilt. You got to know about the guilt, but let's focus on the excitement and use that to try to drive the change that we need to see in the world.
I really like that, because you're trying to make people, you're trying to build the demand for it, in a sense, as opposed to enforce something on people. So it's kind of like, with diets, they never tell you you're going to lose 20 pounds by starvation. But they show you the end result, and they say, this is the body you want, this is the health you want to be in, this is how comfortable you want to breathe, this is how comfortable you want to walk, you want to wear any outfit and look good in it, and go to the beach and swim across the ocean and not run out of breath, and be all these lovely things that put you in all those emotions. You're thinking, I'm swimming in the beach, I'm on the bike, on the trail, all these lovely things, and then you sign up. So they never try to bring you in through, it's going to be hard, Of course, it's going to be hard because you went out and had McDonald's every day for 2 years. Of course, it's going to be hard to shed it now. They never give you that truth. They always tell you how beautiful it's going to be, and you're going to meet like-minded people in the gym and all those things. So it is great, and it's kind of like giving a shot to a kid. You tease them with candy and other things, or even with dogs, you give them peanut butter while they're getting their shot or something. And it's a form of trickery. Now, what you're adding to that is also stating that while we're giving people the emotion and selling it through emotion, we are also educating them on beyond the emotion. So they buy with their hearts, but then they stay and they continue in the investment with their logic. Because then, like you said much earlier, when they buy with their hearts for pollution, with solar panels and other things in the house, they see the air quality get cleaner. They see their trees, flowering better. But then they also look at their electricity bill and like, ooh, I also save money. Let me educate myself. What does that kilowatt say? What is that there? I need to know what that is, because that was 25 cents less. How do I make that 50 cents less? Now I need to learn, because you're giving them some kind of motivation to educate, right? And then that opens the whole door for people to say, where do I sign up to learn the actual science, to better myself for all these different reasons as well? And then as they learn, that's what happened to me, actually. That's how it started for me. I was flying, jetting around the world, doing everything I want. I didn't even understand climate change. And when storms happened, for me, it was, the religious thing. God's angry. We're being too greedy, or I didn't give enough to charity, so of course this happens. So that was, and it's been an archaic mindset, right? I mean, the Greeks used to think that way too, and we're talking thousands of years back. And so there came a time when I went in with the emotion, like you said, and you gave that car example. That exactly happened to me when Tesla first opened up. They had the experience centers. They didn't have showrooms. And so I got into a Tesla and I floored it. And I used to have sports cars then. And it's like, wow, this four-seater that fits my hockey bag in the trunk and everything else is almost as fast as that. And it's a quarter the price. And I don't pay gas, and I get subsidized, and I'm in. So you're absolutely right. It works that way. And bringing the education really supports things. So I like I like that angle a lot, and I'm going to try and promote that angle with some people that I know who are also in the industry. What common misconception do you want to clear? What gets you riled up?
Uh, it's really fairly fundamental, and that is that every time there is a change in the world that we have to adapt to something, I think of the Clean Air Act in the U.S., the Clean Water Act,
Mm-hmm.
the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the transition from horses to automobiles to internal combustion transportation. The mandate for seatbelts, the mandate for airbags in automobiles. Every time this happens, there are a lot of people who say that, oh, the sky is falling, that this is going to blow up the economy, this is going to destroy jobs. The internet's going to destroy jobs, AI is going to destroy jobs,
Mm.
and we never seem to find that. I mean, it changes jobs. Obviously, when we went from horses to automobiles, a lot of horse-related professions had to reinvent themselves as automobile-related professions. But you just don't see a an overall economic impact to these changes. And I would like people to be a little bit less reactionary. I think carbon pricing is a great example of this. That's something where the governments need to impose steadily, and that's how we're doing it, at least in California, steadily impose
Mm.
carbon pricing on the economy. But what's that doing? It's creating economic motivations for people to reduce their electricity consumption. And God knows, with artificial intelligence and data centers and everything else, everything that we can do there is going to help slow this absolutely explosive growth in electricity demand, which is going to benefit all of us. There's an opportunity there to save money. You look at your electricity bill, as you said, and you see X amount of kilowatt hours, here's the price. And within that kilowatt hour price is this amount for carbon. And so if you really want to drive down your electricity bill, you're thinking, if I use a little bit less, I'm not only going to be paying less for the commodity, but I'm going to be paying less for the tax, the carbon cost associated with that commodity. This is a win-win. So let's get to lower carbon electricity. So I don't have to pay as much for my electricity bill, especially because in light of, first of all the macro demand on the grid,
Mm-hmm.
data centers in particular, but also all the micro demands in the home and in businesses as we electrify everything. The economy adapts, people adapt. I mean, that doesn't mean we can legislate everything everywhere all the time and just hope. But as we do this thoughtfully, the sky's not going to fall.
Mm-hmm.
There will be, the internet, did it take some jobs away? Absolutely. Did the economy grow and jobs grow significantly as a result of that? Because we found all these other things that we had to do in this brave new world of the internet? Absolutely. Same thing with the automobile industry.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was a lot of hair pulling about the loss of jobs on the horse in horse related industries. All of a sudden, you're building automobiles, you're fixing automobiles, you're driving automobiles. All
Mm-hmm.
these new jobs come along. So to me, it comes back to this kind of fundamental philosophy that I have, that purpose and prosperity go hand in hand. And just because we can't yet see it doesn't mean it's not going to be there. It's up to
Mm-hmm.
us to find it. But as we go forward, as we make these very eyes wide open compromises, as we transform our world in the way that we need to maintain our habitat and actually make our habitat better, that there is both purpose and prosperity to be found in doing these things.
And you're right. It comes down to what you also advocate for in adaptability, because I was thinking there were saddle makers, and some famous saddle makers who became car seat makers,
Yeah,
or upholstery makers, right? Because the tech and the science of the saddle and the seat is essentially the same. It's just the wrong curve. I mean, one sits on the horse, the other is concave, the other one. So, but the stitching and the methodology and everything else is the same. So you just transition, and even if it's a little different, you adapt and you transition, right? So the transitionary phase is always going to kind of get us out of. And that's what I tell people about AI. I say, some people say, well, if we're going to have AI doing this and that, what are X amount of million of people going to do? And I say that X amount of millions of people are going to adapt to new skills or put their skills into other spaces, and it's just going to work out. It's not going to, we're not going to have half of the world suddenly homeless and starving and dying because we do this. If that was the case, it should have happened so many times over, because like you said, the internet, the automobile, so many inventions should have just destroyed us, should have driven us to extinction economically, but they didn't. We adapted and we became much more prosperous in the process of using that technology to save time, in essence. So I'm with you on that. And what would you like to share with the audience in terms of a key takeaway from this conversation, and like a call to action, a takeaway that you feel people can really take upon themselves and get into that mode of being a part of the solution, or temporarily working towards it?
yeah. To me, it goes back to the beginning of the conversation and seeing our world today. We are in an unprecedented situation as a species. And it might sound too general to talk about us as a species, but this is the situation we're in. All of our challenges are worldwide challenges. All of our solutions are worldwide solutions. And as we talked about in the beginning, we've got climate change, we've got pollution, we've got endemic, we've got political polarization, we've got migration from sea level rise that's going to be has the potential to be incredibly disruptive. Resource conflicts over different sorts of resources, as you pointed out, and these rising generations that won't take no or even slow for an answer. Let's see that whole equation, as big and wicked and scary as it might look. Let's square our shoulders and see that whole equation and start working that whole equation across mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and justice. Everybody's got a part to play in this. Every single person has a part to play in this, both as a consumer, but also professionally, and which is probably a whole nother episode of a podcast. But you don't have to peel the onion very far, no matter who you are, where you are, what you do, to find that, what I call that climate plus all the other stuff, opportunity. And in that way find both purpose and prosperity in making the world a better place.
And you know what? As you're speaking, the last little while, the sun's coming up on the horizon there, and I see it in the reflection behind you, and I think to myself, that is a motivator for pollution, because if you were in, say, New Delhi right now, you would not see the sunrise if you're in the city because of the fog that's continuously, constantly on the city horizon, right? And so seeing that so beautifully rise in a blue sky and everything else, I mean, that's something we all want, like you said, selling it there at that picture right there is something that people will buy, something that people will want, something that people will work towards, because it's the emotion of what matters here in your heart, not trying to say, consume less so that the air quality in Delhi gets better, because that's a hard sell. That's a very hard sell. But consume less because look at the beautiful sunset and the sunrise that you can have and the clarity. That is an easier sell from your backyard, right? So thank you very much, Lincoln. And thank you for speaking on Compassiviste Dialogues. And thank you for your innovative and pioneering work, hopefully to reverse the climate crisis from both angles, the individual resilience and adaptability side, and the policy and the private sector coming in. Because as you said, and I really advocate for this too, these are not aliens in those positions. Politicians are not coming here from another planet just to manage politics, or as much as corporations are shares and nobody really knows what's going on, there's still humans going to work and coming out and making choices and decisions. So they're not going to, not every one of them is going to shoot themselves in the foot. So in the overall, it's not as bleak as people are trying to make it look. I think there's a very hopeful side to it. And thank you for bringing that side of the conversation to the table, as opposed to throwing some statistics and numbers and how awful it is and look where we are, and if we don't stop by the year 20 something, we're all going to die. And you see all of this in propaganda media, and it just scares people away from the whole conversation altogether, and it gets them acting even worse in desperation. So thanks for the way you present everything and the conversation. To our audience, please subscribe to the Compassiviste Dialogues channel and share. Follow us on our social media. And Lincoln and his Climate Plus pod will have all that information down there. All links to Lincoln Bleveans and Compassiviste are listed below, so you can check out the podcast and all the great stuff that's coming from Stanford and there. We're here to help change the world. I'm Ali Horia. Thank you.